Hello, everyone, and welcome to Advancing Perfectly Imperfect Churches, which seems, I know, at the outset to be a bit of a conundrum, but hoping to shed some light on this paradox in some ways that I hope you'll find helpful, both here and then again as we discuss this lecture in class. I'd like to begin by asking you the question, when, if ever, is a pretty good church good enough? Are there times when being pretty good is good enough? Would you answer that yes or no? And if so, why? Uh, when is being a pretty good church good enough, in your opinion? Or is that simply something that is beyond the pale of possibility for you? So I want to give you 3 minutes and consider this. Again, as we've done before, give you a chance to kind of write out some of your thoughts in freehand, or also if you prefer to um, use your word processor. So take the next 3 minutes and consider the question, when, if ever, is a pretty good church good enough? All right, you've had some time to wrestle with this question. We're going to pick this up again and talk about it when we're together in class. I'm really looking forward to seeing how you explore your answer to this kind of uh, warm-up question. But I want to dive in by kind of playing my hand here for you, and I really believe that imperfect can be perfect. And there are lots of ways in which I've seen this to be true in life and in ministry. Certainly, we find in Scripture that there are lots of imperfect people who God used in some very profound ways. Think, for instance, in the Old Testament, Moses certainly didn't get it all right. Abraham didn't get it all right. King David certainly didn't get it all right, and yet he is renowned many, many centuries after the fact as being a person after God's own heart. In the New Testament, we see that Paul doesn't always get it right. The disciples certainly don't get it all right. Even the 12 that Jesus called, Jesus didn't even get it all right with one of his disciples. He didn't have a perfect track record in um, calling, in this case, 12 men who would follow him faithfully. God is able to use imperfect things, imperfect people, and even imperfect churches. Or maybe a better way of saying is, and especially imperfect churches. So not only can imperfection be perfected, but I also believe that bigger is not necessarily better, nor is it necessarily more effective. And I think we're seeing in our time, while megachurches continue to be popular in many fronts, that this trend toward bigger and bigger is fading to some extent. I'm not saying that megachurches are all on the decline. That simply isn't true. But it seems to me that growing a healthy, large church can be very, very challenging. Church health can be difficult to maintain once we find it, and as we grow larger, sometimes those the movement toward larger can sometimes challenge the move toward healthier. So I want to begin by this contention. Church health is measured by competence, not by competition. And I think we see this in a lot of different areas. One of the unintended consequences of the megachurch conferences is that we have a tendency sometimes to clone our own dysfunction along the way if we're not careful. And we tend, as I believe I've already said previously to you, to fall into this trap of what a good friend of mine, a good pastor friend of mine, tends to call ecclesiastical pornography. And by that he means that we have a tendency to carefully airbrush and hide the blemishes of our congregations when we go to these large megachurch conferences, and fall into this trap of thinking that, well, this is a place where everything is humming along on all the right cylinders. There aren't any problems in this particular congregation. But church health calls for competence, not for a competitive spirit. And and again, one of those unintended consequences that comes from our comparison with others, whether it be other pastors or other congregations or other denominations, is what Abraham Maslow called the personality trait of over-aggressiveness. And that really is a sign of a poorly developed identity. That we can get overly focused on growth, on size of a congregation, the size of a youth group, and we begin to play the games that come with fudging our own integrity for the sake of better numbers along the way. It really is a sign of a poorly developed identity. But in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the the, the mature person is one who is what Maslow calls self-actualized. And I really think that understanding of a self-actualized church is what I'm talking about here when I discuss a pretty good church. It really seems to me that some of the best churches out there may not be the most visible ones. Some of them are large. I'm not opposed to large churches. Some of them are small. Some of them are just getting started. Often they're medium-sized congregations, but they're often not on the radar screen of most of us. This is a photo of a tiny Nazarene congregation in Tennessee back taken during the Depression era. This is actually an image that came out of the Farm Security Administration's photo project that was led by Roy Stryker. And there are a number of images that came out of this. In fact, there are thousands and thousands of negatives that are available for public review in the Library of Congress archives. And you probably have recognized some other photographs taken. This one was taken by Gordon Parks, and there are other better known images by Parks, but this Nazarene storefront church is one of them in that collection. Fairly famous photograph. I guess you might be able to argue the most famous photograph of a Nazarene congregation. It certainly does appear to be an imperfect one. But here are a couple other examples. You're likely familiar with this image taken by Dorothea Lange. And this is an image that is called Migrant Mother. It's actually a photograph of Florence Owens Thompson. And it was taken during the Great Depression. And take a guess at how old this migrant mother was at the time. Here's the full image that was one of the most popular photographs ever requested from the Library of Congress. Florence Owens Thompson here was 32 years old when this image was taken by Dorothea Lange. Here's here's another image. The Church of the Nazarene image was taken by Walker Evans. I might have said Gordon Parks. I was getting ahead of myself there. The nitrate photo of the Nazarene storefront church was taken in 1936. Here's a famous image by Gordon Parks, another one of the Farm Security Administration photographers. Gordon Parks went on after the Second World War to be a renowned photographer for Life magazine. And here he took this photograph of a woman by the name of Ella Watson, who ended up being the subject of a number of his photographs during this time. Ella was a charwoman at the Farm Security Administration headquarters in Washington, D.C. And Gordon Parks took this photograph when she was working on the cleaning crew, and he later titled this image American Gothic, obviously trying to show the other side of another famous American image by that same name of American Gothic. But there are ways in which perfection can be revealed even in seemingly imperfect ways. And I'd like to talk about here for a moment what you might call 4 different kinds of churches. The first one you might call struggling churches. And unfortunately, these are the vast majority of churches in our world today. By kind of demographic comparison, these are congregations with less than 200 people attending. These are churches that are trying to keep on keeping on. Since they're under the 200 barrier, that means that this is the vast majority of churches within the Church of the Nazarene, as well as many other denominations as well. I think we're still on average under 100 in Sunday worship on average in the Church of the Nazarene. So these are churches that are trying to keep things going, but it's challenging. And often, in terms of viability, that 200 mark is regarded in increasing measure to be kind of the threshold for viability in many churches today. Below that, it's difficult for a church to have sufficient staff, resources to minister in the community, and so forth. So the first group of churches you might call struggling churches. Second group might call ego-driven churches. And here, these are churches where often the senior pastor runs the show. These are churches that tend to be fearful of planting new congregations from within them. And they're often larger than 1,000 in attendance. And you'd think that these would be churches that would be comfortable with the notion of maybe growing, starting something new beyond their walls. But these are churches that rise and fall with the founding pastor's personality and vision. And when these pastors die or retire or move on, then the churches go into all sorts of tailspins and free fall. The third type of church I'd like to talk with you about, is what you might call a launching pad church. These are often large churches. They are comfortable in their own skin. That they're a gifted church where people are giving and serving, and they see birthing new congregations from within them as being part of the normative task. And so their vision is to replicate themselves over and over again. Well, I suspect that some of you have been in struggling churches, maybe even in some ego-driven churches or launching pad churches. But the good news is that there are lots and lots of opportunities for us to be also in what I would call pretty good churches. These are churches that are often, in Nazarene standards, actually large churches, 300 to 500 in average attendance, but compared with many other denominations and other churches in our community, 300 to 500 really isn't a huge congregation. But these are churches that really focus on competence. and they plant new congregations occasionally. They tend to have a strong and varied staff, and they're comfortable in their own skin, as I said. Uh, they see themselves not as ever being a megachurch, but as a pretty good church, a healthy place where people can come and grow, and a church that has a vision to expand and reach its community. So let me ask you, which of these would you prefer to lead? Where would you prefer to serve on staff? In an ego-driven megachurch, in a launching pad church, in a struggling church, or in a pretty good church? There are, I think, 12 paths, you might say, to follow this metaphor of perfected imperfection, and I'd like to talk through some of these with you for the next few minutes. I think the first path to perfected imperfection is to be a church that is simple. And by simple, I'm not saying less than or stupid or anti-intellectual. But I'm talking here about authenticity and transparency and reality. These are churches that recognize that you sometimes have to say no to many good things in order to say yes to the things that you can accomplish and that you should accomplish at a given time. These are leaders who have laser sights. They really recognize the things that they believe that God is leading them to at this particular point in time. Not at some kind of machine gun approach where you have to try to do everything under the sun. If you look at the Google anchor page rather online, you'll find a very simple design. There's lots of white space. In fact, there's been a number of studies that have been done, even doctoral dissertations, design dissertations about the Google anchor page. It's incredibly simple, and yet it's very, very effective. The next trait is what I would call being upward, and this is something that's really essential when you're working with people in a church or a youth group or a congregation where there's a struggling mindset. Um, and this is to say that in spite of the challenges in front of you, your focus is on God. Uh, and so in worship, in spite of the fact that you have very limited resources, there's a confidence and an expectancy and an engagement that comes in worship that focuses on God's positive presence. I think that perfected imperfection also comes from an outward stance, and this is all about reaching beyond one's walls, which we've touched on a number of different times already in this course, and it's about nudging people, as we've already discussed before, nudging them closer to God. Uh, and really, outreach is like a tool belt. Sometimes we need a variety of tools in order to accomplish that. But how are we reaching outward? Not again, not in a machine gun style where we try to do everything under the sun, but how are we intentionally looking beyond our four walls? I believe also that perfected, imperfect churches are anointed, which should go without saying. But by this I mean that it's better to be profound than to be clever, to be authentic and to focus on what God is actually doing in our lives, as opposed to coming up with the latest and most hip way of swiping something off of reality television or whatever the case may be. Believe it or not, I think that perfectly imperfect churches are fun. This this begins often with our leadership. Have fun with the people you serve with in ministry. Take time to have fun with your leadership team, with your staff, or with your youth leadership team, or your church board, or your mission council, or wherever your area of ministry is focusing on. And that has a way of becoming contagious in the congregation. Uh, this is something that we see in natural church development, the sense of is this a fun place to be? Uh, is a really important trait. Also, safety is an essential to perfectly imperfect churches. It means that we don't force anything on anyone. You give people time to come along. The Alpha Course is a ministry that I'd encourage you to take a look at. Nikki Gumbel has been the chief proponent of it at Holy Trinity Brompton Church in London. And I'd encourage you to even pause this and do a Google search for the Alpha Course and see what you find. But one of the foundational tenets of Alpha is that as people come together to discuss God and faith, that no question is too simple and no question is too hostile. Cultivate an environment where people are safe to be themselves, to ask honest questions, and that they'll be respected by the people around them. Along with this, I think, is a sense of inclusivity, that perfectly imperfect churches focus on acceptance versus approval. It means that you accept people where they're at, and even if you don't approve with what they're doing, it means that you make room for them to come on the journey with you, and that you welcome them. So often, people in our communities are convinced before they ever walk in the door, I would never go there because I would never be accepted. But we may not approve of what people are doing or approve of the views that they hold, but if we hope to reach them, we need to offer some acceptance in hopes of building a meaningful relationship with them. It also means that you follow up on people. You follow up on kids who come to your youth group. You follow up when people are away. You let them know that they're important and they're an essential part of your ministry. Perfectly imperfect churches are trusting places. It means that you find ways for people to build meaningful relationships where trust is established and fostered. This is done often through small groups, even Sunday school classes. Find ways, affinity groups along the way, where people can build relationships in a trusting environment and grow as a result of it. The next trait I'd like to talk with you about briefly is something I'm calling atmospheric, uh, uh, an atmospheric sense. And atmosphere is really more of a right-brained trait. And these are the intangibles that are largely unseen by regulars in our congregations. But they're especially noticed by people who are new to our youth group or new to our church. And so things like having coffee in the sanctuary or appropriate lighting, um, the pace and the flow of worship, minimizing distractions, all of these things help cultivate an atmosphere where people recognize this is a place where people genuinely care for me and might even love me. And we might, as a result, help them discover how much God loves them as well. When I was in my church in Phoenix, I worked with my board on uh, trying to find honest feedback from guests to our church, and we offered them a $25 gift certificate if they would come to our church and give us a brief evaluation of what their experience was, and it was invaluable. It was worth way more than $25, and some of these people actually later on started coming to our church, even though we didn't put the screws to them. We genuinely wanted to know what their sense was. I think that perfectly imperfect churches are generous places. Generosity is something, again, that it can be contagious. And we need to model this as a church, giving ourselves away to our community. And it also comes from what I would call an abundance mentality. When I was in my first church out of seminary, a tiny little congregation in Western Washington, I had a great, really fine young man who was in the Navy, and he was our church board, our church treasurer at the time, and his name was David. And David was a wonderful young man, and was committed to our congregation. David was very much a black and white kind of a person, and those kind of folks often make good treasurers, coincidentally. And I'll never forget one Saturday night we had a missionary who came to our little church. We didn't have a building. We set up on Saturday night. So we scheduled this missionary to come to our group after we set up on Saturday night, and the missionary family spoke, and then we had a little social with them because we already had access to the building, and we took up an offering for that family. And we were a small congregation, maybe 30 people at the time, so we didn't have a whole lot of money to offer. But we took in, I don't remember, some $81.16 or something like that. And so we passed the plates, and the treasurer, David, he came up to me with a slip of paper and it said $81.16 on it. And I said, "Oh, that's great." I said, "Write the check for $100." And he handed me the slip of paper back again. He says, "But Pastor, we brought in $81.16." And I said, I understand, but let's go ahead and round it up to $100." And he passed the piece of paper back to me again, and he said, "But we only brought in $81.16." And I said, I understand that, but let's be generous. Let's round up to the nearest $100. And he struggled with that for a moment, and then said, "Okay," and he did. And I didn't think much more about that until several years later when I left that congregation. And David came up to me as that final month of saying goodbyes to people and preparing for the next chapter for us and for them. And David came to me and he said, "Do you remember that night that we had the missionary in our church, and we took in a certain amount of money, and you encouraged me to round it up on behalf of our congregation?" And I said, "Yeah, I remember that." And he says, "Well, I want you to know that until that time, whenever I wrote my tithe check, I tithed down to the penny." And he said, "If I made, $1,513.26, then I tithed $151 and whatever that would be, 31 cents or whatever it was, down to the penny." He said, "I tithe 10%. And he said, "You've inspired me to learn to round up in my life and to try to be a more generous-hearted person." And he was already a generous man, but he saw an opportunity to be more generous. And I think that we need to find ways to try to model that whenever we can. Perfectly imperfect churches also are true places. It seems to me um, that churches and leaders really must define the essentials and then make room for the non-essentials. Make room for our traditions, our opinions. Um, we need to be true to that. We need to help people understand what we do believe, and then, but also make room for people who see things differently. And so, it'd be an interesting conversation. What do you see being the essentials? What are those essentials? And I know that list varies from person to person, but it seems to me that things like who Jesus is an essential. That the Bible is our guide for life. We really can trust it. That we need to be in a loving relationship with God. That those are essentials. But whether Jesus is going to come back before or after the tribulation or whatever, some of those issues I don't think really are necessarily essentials. Lastly, I think that perfectly imperfect churches are cooperative. And think about this for a moment. Look at the collective impact of churches. Churches really do an amazing amount. Why is it that we fall into the trap of thinking that we have to do everything? And it seems to me that one of the things that really encourages me these days is that in increasing measure, um, leaders and churches are asking the question, how can we come alongside others to impact our community? In the past, there tended to be this sense that we needed to do everything ourselves, and if if a particular ministry came up with an idea, then we needed to have our denominational equivalent to that. Um, but we need to recognize also that we really are already a really big church, um, and that together we can accomplish far more than just what we can do in our own little ways. And that when we cooperate with others, being a pretty good church can make us really, pretty great. So, as leaders, we have to become more comfortable in our own skin and more comfortable with our own churches and help them to see that being pretty good, even perfectly imperfect, really can be exactly what God needs.